Good afternoon, everyone. How are you feeling? We need a little bit more energy than that. I'm part of the Miami flavor for the FII conference. Good afternoon. How are you doing? Oh, great. All right. So, uh, all right. So, what we're about to have now, welcome to the stage, Professor. We're going to have a little bit of a different energy right now because we have the joy of a debate. And I'm going to introduce our esteemed debaters in a second. Just by way of introduction, my name is Saif Ishouf. I proudly serve as the founder of Lab 22C. And if you're here today at this exact moment, it's because you want to learn what lives under a pineapple under the sea. SpongeBob joke didn't work for a deep sea mining conversation, but I mean, come on. I mean, the coffee has to be hitting. But in in all seriousness, this conversation we're about to have, which is structured as a debate format, which kudos to the FII organizers for enabling this type of discussion. This conversation about deep sea mining is something that is central to our global economy as well as our global environment. And just for basic context, before we get into the exchange between Carlos and Gerard, the global deep sea mining industry in the last few years previously was worth around $650 million in 2020. And many estimates put it as potentially blossoming to over $15 billion by the year 2030. This is really a new frontier when we think about the exploration for minerals, similar to the Arctic, as well as when we think about exploration in space. Joining us here today are two esteemed leaders that represent distinct viewpoints in their work in this issue topic around deep sea mining. It's important to realize that we've got perspectives that give us an opportunity to understand both the environmental risks and concerns, as well as the unbridled economic potential for abundance of materials and minerals in our world. So the format that we've got here today, because it is a debate style, so you have to shift your brain in thinking about what you're going to see. Each speaker, after I introduce them, is going to have an opportunity to give just 2 quick minutes of remarks. Each speaker will then also have an opportunity to provide a quick rebuttal. So we want it to be very spicy. So if there's controversy and you're wondering like, oh snap, did they say that? Yes, this is the panel that you're going to get some of that type of exchange. It is not meant to be overly courteous and polite because this is a very, very complicated issue with nuanced perspective. So on stage today, we've got Gerard Barron. He's the CEO of the metals company. And we're going to be hearing some tremendous insight from Gerard. And we also have with us Professor Carlos Duarte, a renowned marine ecologist at KAUST University. So I'm going to go ahead and ask Gerard to give us some opening remarks, followed by Professor Duarte, and each one of you will then have an opportunity for a quick rebuttal. But opening remarks are 2 minutes each. Okay. Gerard.
Saif, thank you. And thanks for joining us today. So I'm the CEO of the Metals Company, and we're focused on developing a very large, abundant resource of polymetallic nodules, like the one in my hand. And they're located in the abyssal zone of our ocean, and about half of our ocean is categorized as the abyssal zone, and it's about 4,000 meters below sea level. Where we're focused is 1,000 miles southwest of San Diego. And the reason why this is of interest is because this nodule is filled with the critical minerals that we're going to need billions of tons more of in the coming decades. And we need them to continue the industrialization process in the developing world. We need them to meet the needs of a growing population, and we need them to help feed the transition as we move into friendlier technologies, including electric vehicle batteries and other things. Now, mining, of course, happened in all the really obvious places on land. And what we're doing today is pushing into the most pristine, biodiverse habitats. In the case of nickel, which is about half of our revenue in this nodule, we're moving into tropical rainforests. 100% of the growth in nickel production over the last 4 years has come from nickel laterites. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that to get access to the laterite, you have to remove what's above it. And that's some of the most biodiverse tropical rainforests, and often the indigenous people living in them. And so everything has an impact. Our company has generated more than 1 petabyte of environmental data. And just to put that in context, if you think
Gerard,
about
like about
Congress,
10 seconds in your opening
Congress,
remarks.
if you digitized Congress, data that's about 3 petabytes. So we have like 1 petabyte of environmental data, and that is informing us as we understand what the impacts are of picking these up and turning them into important metals.
Thank you, Gerard. Carlos, opening remarks, please, Professor.
Thank you. So thank you for having me here today and the opportunity to discuss deep sea mining. So first of all, let me state that metals are the foundations of civilizations. So there's not a single civilization that has not built their foundations on metals. So we need metals and we'll continue to use metals. But addressing the question of who owns the ocean, that is the title of this panel, really our predicament, and I would say for the Western world, because indigenous people have other views, our predicament on the oceans started when the Romans consolidated their legal code into the Justinian Code, and they declared the ocean terra nullius, and they declared marine life res nullius, which means that the ocean is owned by no one, and marine life is owned by no one, which means that the first one that grabs it owns it, right? So that is the foundation for 2,000 years of the depletion of the oceans and the syndrome that we refer to as the tragedy of the commons, which has led to the depletion of ocean resources, because if you don't take that, somebody else is going to take them. So that remained the situation of the oceans until around 1600, where a Dutch lawyer then stated a law that they actually called the Cannonball Law, that still regulates the ownership of coastal waters by states and so on, and that was based on how far could you shoot a cannon in the 1600s. So it was 3 miles, and therefore they claim sovereignty over 3 miles, and then later on Iceland then challenged that limitation because of what we call the Cod Wars, and then the special economic zones of nations were unilaterally then extended and eventually now reach about 200 miles. Then that leaves about 60% of the ocean still not owned by anyone, so that's still under the tragedy of the commons. And then there's a UN framework called the Law of the Sea, which, by the way, the US did not ratify because President Reagan in 1982 did not agree with the provisions for metal extraction from the deep sea. But most other nations agree that this 60% of the ocean, there's the open waters where most of the abyssal plains rest, need to be subject to some type of governance, and the same rules that apply to resource utilization elsewhere should apply to these waters. So then that's...
10 more seconds, Professor, in your opening remarks.
Yeah, so that's the situation we're in. We are talking about who can access these resources, but in the same time, we're developing another approach to the ocean economy called the blue economy, which actually is a regenerative approach to the use of the ocean that is not extractive, and it can deliver 5 times more value to the economy than the destructive approaches to the ocean.
Thank you so much, Professor. Gerard, you have a minute to provide a quick rebuttal to some of the comments and observations of Professor Duarte.
Well, it's established no one has sovereign ownership of our oceans, and of course some nations have signed on to this convention, as Professor mentioned, and some have not. And of course, if you have signed on to it, that which is known as UNCLOS, then you are bound by the rules under which UNCLOS stipulates. And of course, what happened when regulation is, we've always said, the best way to protect the marine environment. And it's one of the challenges we face at the moment, because this intergovernmental organization, I noticed one of the panels talking about this later today, but this intergovernmental organization established in 1994 hasn't been all that successful, because it's now 2025 and we're still waiting on the rules. Now, of course, what that means is that members who have not signed UNCLOS, or in fact even members of UNCLOS, may move away from those set of frameworks and start their own extractive industries, because I think we know that 70% of the planet is ocean. We have to apply first principle logic, and that is carry out extractive industries in parts of the planet with the least life, not the most life. And we have to think about it from a full set of impacts. And I think that's why we're going to talk about geopolitics later, but geopolitics has made ocean resources very, very topical in every debate now. It seems to be the #1 issue.
Thank you so much, Gerard. Professor, would you like to provide a quick rebuttal to Gerard's opening remarks?
Well, I'm not really rebuttaling. These are fact-based statements, so I'm just providing additional viewpoints for the audience to make their own judgment about the topic of discussion. So basically, mining in the ocean should be subject to the same requirements of mining anywhere else. And one of the requirements for licensing for mining is that at the end of the concession, the operator need to be able to restore the habitat to the former state. So habitat restoration is a mandate after the end of the mining operations. And the problem with deep sea mining is that you need to think that we're talking about a habitat where only fewer people than have been immune have been in the abyssal plains. So it is really poorly explored. Despite petabytes of data, only 25% of the seafloor has been mapped. There is now a project to complete the mapping of the seafloor by 2030, but it still is largely unexplored, largely unknown, and an assessment, let's say a war game, where scientists were put together to try to devise how to restore a deep sea habitat after mining. They could actually not find a way to restore the habitat. So that means that the requirements that governed mining operations on land cannot yet be applied. You know, that's a matter of investing in research and innovation. So it's not an absolute no, but we need to be able to develop the capacity to not only understand what it might be impacted, but also to restore the habitat to the previous state. So based with this limitation, we probably need to think outside the box and think where else can we get the metals. First of all, do we need the metals altogether? Because we are in the predicament that to be able to solve a problem in one component of the biosphere, which is the atmosphere, we might create a havoc in another component of the biosphere, which is land and ocean, by mining. So I think we need to challenge the need for all this gluttony of metals simply because there are other alternatives. And it's not about the sourcing of the metals, it's about what we do at the end of life. So we don't have technology to be able to recycle batteries safely for lithium-based batteries. So right now there's only two approaches. One is
I'm gonna have to cut you off, Professor,
Okay.
only because we've already entered into the geopolitical arena, and we will talk about the C word. And if you're American, you know what the C word means: China, right? So we're gonna talk about China in a
just say
little
one
bit.
thing?
But I know you've got a quick thought, and it's a debate. So go ahead, throw a punch.
Well, Professor mentioned that scientists have played out the game of how to restore this habitat, but we're not playing games. We're generating petabytes of data. We're spending hundreds of millions of dollars, and this is one of the narrative warfares that we've been up against for the last decade, because ill-meaning NGOs who don't have any data, they just have hunches, they have desktop studies, like to catastrophize potential impacts without having any data to back it up. Whereas what we've always said is, can we just rely on the data? So we don't have to rely on war games to imagine how these areas recover. We were out there commercially collecting nodules in 2022. We went back there a year later to see how the area recovered. Amazingly encouraging results. If we date back to the 1970s when they started to pick up these very same rocks, there was a campaign completed in the last 6 months where they revisited that site to see the recovery after 45 years. So we have the data that is able to inform us. And I think that's one of the biggest issues we have, is communicating that. And of course, we've now learned that USAID is also topical, had funded almost $10 million through a news network to campaign the anti-DSM position with journalists. $10 million of Australian taxpayers' money.
Okay, so now I'm going to cut you off, only because I have the joy. You know when you're in school and your professor keeps talking and you wish you could cut them off? I mean, the professor is brimming with the response. Either I jump to the next question, or Professor, please, quick response
I'm
before
just
we go to
going
the question.
to invite also Gerard to reflect, and everybody in the audience, what are we going to do with, I believe it's 30,000 million tons of batteries that will come to the end of life in 2030, and we don't have the technology to recycle them safely. That's a time bomb of a disaster in the environment for everyone. So there are alternatives to that. One of them is actually for lithium. My colleagues at CAUS published a technology recently that can source hundreds of billions of tons of lithium from desalination brine, and also from brine that exists in oil exploration wells. So we don't need to go to the deep sea. It's actually much cheaper and safer, and there are no impacts on marine life. So there are alternatives to that, but also we need to rethink batteries, and there are now approaches to create batteries from graphene and also create batteries from organic materials that don't carry metals. They can be recycled safely, and they actually have 10 times less mass than metal-based batteries, so you can extend the range of your cars by 10 times. So why do we need to just buy in of the predicament that we need to expand the extraction of lithium by 7-fold? We don't.
So before we respond, let's get back to the
I must
geopolitics.
respond.
Okay.
We don't have any lithium. We're focused on nickel, and the alternative to nickel is equatorial rainforest destruction.
Okay. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. So
Still batteries, right?
Batteries, steel.
Yeah, yes, but
batteries
yeah,
is a small use case, but a growing one.
Yeah,
but
but
you cannot make
yeah.
a ton of stainless steel without nickel.
No, that's true. But we are not looking at 7 times increase in this. The increase is driven by electrification, and we can replace that by organic electrification products and also graphene.
let's move on to the next. Let's move on to the next set of questions, because this is even spicier. I mean, what you're talking about right now is pretty hot. This is hotter. So, Gerard, I'm going to jump back to you, and this question is going to also be for the professor. So the panel is called "Do States Own the Ocean?" And the question really, and you have to deal with this as one of the largest companies in the world in this space, is who really owns the oceans beyond national waters? And we've touched upon that. How do geopolitics shape this scramble for resources? And are we seeing healthy global cooperation or a completely new wave of competition? What's actually happening out there?
Well, no one has sovereignty over the oceans. No one. And everyone has freedom of passage on the ocean, which covers fishing and cable laying and deep sea metals. Now, some nations, in fact 168 of them, signed on to UNCLOS, where they agreed to be bound by a set of rules. The United States is not one of them, and there are a number of other countries as well. And of course, geopolitics are at play. You know, there are games going on by this regulator that I mentioned, the International Seabed Authority, that were established in 1994 to put in place a regulatory environment to allow the development of this resource. And the exploration regs were put in place in 2001. We have some. But the final mining code hasn't. And there are forces at work, and those forces consist of NGO-influenced governments who are putting spanners in works to try and slow down, because they have a view that we can degrowth, or we can come up with miraculous new studies that don't require metals. It's all nonsense. Or in some cases, there are some players who have a belief that they can just slow it down because they're not ready yet. And maybe China's one of those. China's 5 years behind us. I already have my first production vessel. I've already proven how we turn it into metals, but we're a long way ahead of everyone else. So if you're not ready to go, you might want to slow that down. Now, the United States, of course, might say, well, we're not part of it, and we've been very clear why we're not part of it. And so there is a window open to countries like the United States or non-signatory countries, or in fact, countries can, reverse their signature as well if they so choose. But if you don't put the rules in place, then people will make their own arrangements.
Thank you so much. Professor, same question. What are your thoughts about the competition, collaboration, what actually is happening out there and what will happen? And we've got to wrap up in 5 minutes. So
yeah, well, just a counterfactual to the fact that nobody owns the ocean. So as indicated, the U.S. did not ratify the law of the sea. But do you think that then, for instance, it will be easy for, let's say, for a Chinese company to come and mine metals in the Gulf of America? Will that be allowed? Because therefore there's no ownership. So I don't think that will work, really. So in fact, there is ownership, and everybody recognizes it, whether you sign a treatise or not. In fact, the U.S. has almost not ratified any of the UN conventions because they believe it's a concession of governance to another institution, but they do obey by rules as well, and they would not allow other countries to come and explore minerals in U.S. waters because they claim them as their own. So I think just a very
there's
simple
also a new American doctrine called FAFO.
Yeah, but what this is happening. I was last year in the Cook Islands. The Cook Islands has a population of 35,000 people with about 2 million square kilometers of ocean space. They have very little capacity to manage and govern their resources, And it is those nations that are big ocean states with very little capacity that can be subject to companies that might not be too ethical in their approach to ocean. So, in fact, one of the elements that Gerard mentioned, which is data, data has a lot of value. So you already have a business on ocean data before you collect your nodules. So you can develop the business from that, help other nations and collaborate so that when you work in other nations' territory, which they do have territorial waters, you can actually reciprocate and everybody wins. So collaboration is key. And I have no objections to extract minerals from the metals from the deep sea if it's made safely and if the evidence that the habitat can be restored can be produced. So I will encourage Gerard to publish the results, and that will bring us all in the same page.
Yes, absolutely. And
So
we do.
just heads up, we've got 20 seconds final, 20 seconds final. I'm getting the heads up from our organizers.
And interesting, only last week, the Prime Minister of the Cook Islands was in China signing a collaboration with President Xi on the development of those very same resources. And so it's a topical issue. And I think the other issue I would leave people with, that trust the data, and the question is, what's the alternative? Like, if not this, then are we happy to maintain the current mining practices? I believe we're heading towards circularity, but that's decades away. Recycled materials will make up a bigger part of supply in the future. The question is, the next several decades, when we just have a multi-billion ton shortfall, and we should be focused on where can we get those metals with the least impact on humans and on our important environment.
Thank you so much. Professor, final quick thought.
Collaboration is key, and research and innovation are going to be key to address these conundrums. And I think there's what was referred as fantasies, they already exist. So you can Google a company in Australia that is already commercializing organic batteries, and there are graphene batteries too. We just need to opt for options that are cost effective, they're proven, and they can avoid problems in the ocean and other parts of the biosphere.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm round of applause for Gerard Barron and Professor Carlos Duarte. Thank you, gentlemen.